Hi guys, and welcome back to Biological Molecules. I guess I haven't scared you off with the first part, huh? We're on to part 2 here. Part 2 is going to cover lipids. So previously, on last week's episode, not last week, but you get the idea. We looked at carbs, alright, monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Here we are going to look at lipids, specifically fats. And another type of lipid called phospholipids, and these really cool lipids called steroids. Alright. So, following our same organizational scheme as before, where we'll talk about the characteristics, the classification, and then the functions. Starting with the characteristics of lipids. Lipids are, first and foremost, very hydrophobic. In fact, that is the only characteristic that all lipids have in common. They are all hydrophobic. Or almost all. And the reason why they're hydrophobic is because there's just lots and lots and lots of non-polar HCH bonds. Let me show you a picture of one of these as an example. Look at this. HCH as far as the eye can see, except for a little bit over here, but we're going to conveniently ignore that. Okay? So very, very hydrophobic, very non-polar. Lipids are the only biological molecule that do not interact very well with water. So all other three classes, carbs, proteins, and nucleic acids, they interact well with water. Lipids, not so much. Lipids are mostly made out of just carbon and hydrogen for the most part. And they're made out of carbon and hydrogen in these long chains. Again, let me go look at that other picture. See these long chains of carbon and hydrogen right there? These long chains, they have a name. They're called hydrocarbons, right? Hydrocarbon chains. Go figure. Right? No, really, I promise. That's the real word for it. I'm not trying to pull one over on you. Okay, it's that easy. It's that easy. Now, there is a huge variety of lipids, though. Here's the not-so-easy part. There's a huge variety of lipids, and it's not so easy to figure out how they're made. They don't follow that monomer-polymer rule thing that we learned before with carbs. Now, there's a little bit of loosey-goosiness in the definition here. Some biology people will say that lipids do the monomer-polymer thing, some don't. I kind of think it just depends on what time of day you ask them, what kind of mood they're in, and what they had for lunch. So for our purposes, we're going to try and keep it simple. We're just going to say they don't. When we look at lipids, there's three major classes of lipids. Fats, also known as triglycerides, steroids, and phospholipids. And these are the three big classes. There's others, there's waxes and things like that too, but we don't care about waxes. So we're going to not learn that here. And as far as what lipids do, they're for long-term energy storage. Fats stick around for a long time, as some of us well know, right? Remember, another name for fats is triglycerides. And almost everybody uses fats or triglycerides for long-term energy storage, not just animals, but also plants, too. Think about nuts, right? Lots of oil in there. Think about olive oil and vegetable oil and things like that. We use steroids, specifically a particular type of steroid called steroid hormones, in order for our cells to talk to each other. So if you've heard of estrogen, testosterone, those are actually steroid hormones, and they tell our cells to behave differently. Phospholipids form cell membranes. These are different from cell walls. Cell membranes, cell walls, totally different. Previously, with carbs, we learned about cellulose, we learned about peptidoglycan, cellulose for plants, peptidoglycan for bacteria. We said that those form the cell walls. Phospholipids form cell membranes. And here's the thing. Everybody's got a cell membrane. No matter what you are, you have a cell membrane. Not everybody has a cell wall. Okay, let's dive right in. Let's look at fats. First of all, fats are very hydrophobic. Very, very hydrophobic. They don't interact well with water at all. Fats include things like butter and oils, right? And think about it. What happens when you mix oil with water? Well, it doesn't mix, right? Now, fats are manufactured using condensation reactions. We will see that on the next slide. Okay, so they kind of sort of do follow that monomer-polymer thing, but as I said before, it's a little weird how that works. Let's leave that behind for now. Look at the classification. So fats have a couple different names. They're known as triglycerides. That's actually a quite common name. The other term, triacylglycerols, that's less common, but you may also see it. So for our purposes, we just need to know the term fat and triglyceride. Okay? Triacylglycerols, you may hear depending on your anatomy and physiology instructor. And there are 3 different types of fats or triglycerides, what are called saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and the evil trans fats. When we look at fats, whether saturated, unsaturated, or trans, there's 2 major parts to them, what are called fatty acid tails and glycerol heads. I love this terminology, tails and heads, right? So fatty acid tails and glycerol heads. Be careful with this. A fatty acid tail is not the same as a fat. A fatty acid tail is not the same as a fat. Fats are made of fatty acid tails. It's kind of like saying cotton is not the same as a shirt, right? A shirt is made of cotton. So these fatty acid tails are between 2 and 20 carbons long. A glycerol head is only 3 carbons. We'll see the structure of these in just a moment. Now, what do fats do? As we just said, they're for long-term energy storage in many living things. Sometimes way too long. Fats can stick around for years, as some of us well know. Remember we talked about glycogen in animals and how that sticks around just for 20 minutes? Well, glycogen, you go through all of your glycogen on a daily basis. You don't go through all of your fat on a daily basis. We also do use fat for cushioning, specifically in the butt region. I believe that's the scientific term, the butt. It's not, don't worry. We also use it for insulation to help keep us warm. That's why my skinny friends are always colder than I am. Neener, neener. So here's the structure of fats. Remember, it's made of 3 fatty acid tails connected to a single glycerol head. Those fatty acid tails are between 2 and 20 carbons long. The glycerol head is 3 carbons long. Alright, so far so good. Here's what the fatty acid tails look like. So they are made of these long hydrocarbon chains. Carbon and hydrogen, very, very non-polar, with a small area of polarity, but not big enough to really outcompete the huge area of non-polar. And this is what a saturated fatty acid looks like. An unsaturated fatty acid, however, has these double bonds in there. And notice how those double bonds, they bend the chain. The technical term for this, you're not going to believe this, they kink the chain. So an unsaturated fatty acid is kinky, scientifically speaking. I promise I'm not making that up. You can Google it. It's real. And the reason why these are called unsaturated fatty acids is because technically you could add another hydrogen on this carbon right here. You could add another hydrogen right there, breaking that double bond. So this hydrocarbon chain doesn't have as many hydrogens as it could have. It is unsaturated. Whereas the saturated fat does have as many hydrogens as it could have. It's packed full. There's no double bonds that we can break. Alright, so you're going to have 3 of these fatty acid tails, either saturated, unsaturated, or a combination, and 1 glycerol head. You join 3 of these to 1 glycerol head and you got a fat. Now, one thing I do kind of want to point out, it's kind of interesting. Notice this glycerol, 3 carbons, an oxygen. This is actually a sugar. It's actually a carb. Kind of weird, huh? So anyways, how do they come together? Here's our glycerol head in orange. Here's our fatty acid tail. This fatty acid tail right here is totally saturated in this example. So we take the hydroxyl group. We're taking the hydroxyl group right there off the fatty acid tail, linking it to the hydrogen of the glycerol head, take out some water. What type of reaction is that? Oh, it's right there. Condensation. or dehydration. Didn't realize it was right there. You do that 3 times and you attach a fatty acid tail per carbon on the glycerol head. So you end up with 3 fatty acid tails. And those fatty acid tails, they can be all saturated, all unsaturated, or a combination of the two. Here in this example, we have a combination. This, by the way, the fact that we have 3 fatty acid tails is why this is called a triglyceride. Tri refers to the 3 fatty acid tails. The glycer part of glyceride refers to the 3-carbon glycerol head. So this is what a single fat molecule looks like. This is what oil and butter and other wonderful, delicious things look like. Now really quick, I wanted to take a closer look at saturated fats. A saturated fat is anything that has all or almost all saturated fatty acid tails. Alright, so a saturated fat is a fat that has all or almost all saturated fatty acid tails. And these include things like butter, shortening, lard, bacon grease, and human fat. So you may notice a common theme in these. Most saturated fats are from animals. So don't eat your fellow humans. Your cholesterol will go up as a result. Okay. One of the things that saturated fats do is they cause the production of cholesterol when you consume them, so that's why they're bad for you. We'll see what cholesterol does too, don't worry. Now these saturated fats are long, straight, stick-straight tails. Right there, they're very, very straight, and so imagine this molecule kind of all, you get a million fat molecules all squished together. They can compact really closely, so they can create a dense, rigid group of molecules, and for that reason, these saturated fats tend to be dense and rigid. Think about butter, right, versus oil. Of course, if you heat them up, all bets are off. Now, where we find these in humans is in our liver, surrounding our organs for cushioning, and subcutaneously. Subcutaneously means under the skin. Your skin, the technical term for your skin is the cutaneous membrane, right? So subcutaneously means under the skin. This is kind of a cool picture. This is floating around the internet for a while. And it's not exactly accurate. These 2 images were taken at slightly different body planes, so the woman on the right actually looks slightly skinnier than she really is. But the take-home message is still good. This shows where we tend to store fat, excess fat, and you can really, really see obviously subcutaneously. So the white is fat. And so we see a lot underneath the skin. We also have a lot surrounding the organs. Look at the heart in particular. Right there, that makes you want to lose weight, huh? Now here's what this actually looks like inside our cells. So this is a picture of a couple dozen individual fat-storing cells. They're called adipose cells. This is a single cell right here. In dark purple, that's actually the cell membrane. And then inside is all white because fat doesn't stain in these images. Your cells are not actually purple, right? It'd be really entertaining if they were, but they're not. This is stained using a particular dye to help us see the cells. So the stain is attracted to the cell membrane, but it's not attracted to the fat inside. So inside, it's all white. These cells, by the way, are so packed full of fat that their nuclei is squished up against the side. And this is what your fat looks like, what your fat cells look like. Now, where in your body you accumulate fat is actually determined in part by the ratio of estrogen to testosterone that you have. Relatively speaking, the more testosterone you have, the more you tend to store fat around your belly. That's why guys tend to have that beer belly, that beer gut, right? It's just where they tend to store fat, whereas women tend to store fat more around hips and thighs. Okay. Oh, I forgot I had this. I totally forgot about this. Oh, man. Anyways, one thing that's kind of depressing? Once you form these fat cells, by the way, when you gain weight, these cells divide, you make more of them, so you can store more fat. But when you lose weight, these cells don't go away. They become smaller, they shrink. That's why it is so easy after you've gained and lost weight. That's why it's so easy to regain that weight, is because the cells are already there waiting to be filled again. So yes, I'm sorry I just ruined your day. But hopefully this makes it better. Okay, let's look at unsaturated fats now. These include olive oil, vegetable oil, most coconut oils. And when we looked at their fatty acid tails, they are kinked, they're bent, because of those carbon-carbon double bonds. See those carbon-carbon double bonds right there in the unsaturated fat? That means that a fat molecule that has lots of unsaturated fatty acids doesn't really compact, it doesn't really compress very well. So these bent molecules, they slide past each other, they don't really easily compact, and so they tend to remain liquid, right? So think of our oils, right? Vegetable oil, olive oil, they tend to stay liquid at room temperature. Coconut oil is kind of a weird exception. Coconut oil is a little bit saturated, a little bit unsaturated. Now, this stuff you don't need to know, but it's just cool, alright? If you were a weird kid like me, then you read the back of the cereal boxes. You read, like, the nutrition facts on the back of your cereal boxes. This is before cell phones and whatever. And so I had nothing to do in the morning except read the back of the cereal boxes as I was eating breakfast. I know, I had such a hard life, didn't I? Right? So I saw on those nutrition labels, there's a couple different types of fats. There's what's called monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. Monounsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats have only one carbon-carbon double bond. Right here, here's one monounsaturated fatty acid. Right here. You can see just one kink in there. Polyunsaturated fats have two or more carbon-carbon double bonds. They're more kinky. Alright? So polyunsaturated fats, because their tails are more bent, they tend to stay liquid even at low temperatures. Even if you stick them in the freezer, they tend to stay liquid. So if you read the nutrition facts on the back of a label, they'll separate out the different fat types into saturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated. Now there is one particular type of fat that you may have heard of called omega-3 fatty acids. And maybe now you're kind of going, oh wait, I recognize fatty acid now. I know what it is. And omega-3 fatty acid is any fatty acid that has the double bond 3 carbons away from the end. Omega means end. It's the last letter in the Greek alphabet. Alright? So the very end carbon, right here is the omega carbon. An omega-3 fatty acid is one that has the double bond 3 carbons away from the end. And the reason why we say you should get omega-3s in your diet is because they're actually used as the starting point for the creation of many parts of our cell membranes. So we cannot by ourselves, we can't actually produce omega-3 fatty acids. We've lost the proteins that do it for us. We no longer produce them. So we need to consume them and then convert those omega-3 fatty acids into other things, into our cell membrane, actually, as it turns out. Okay, now finally, the evil, the horrible trans fats. You may have heard about trans fats, and yes, they are just as terrible as you've heard. You don't need to know this information either, but again, it's cool. We've gone to all this trouble of learning this. Let's take it a step further. Trans fats are purely artificial. You will never find trans fats from a natural product. And how they're produced is they're produced by taking an unsaturated fat, like this fatty acid tail found in vegetable oil, and forcibly adding hydrogen to it. This is called hydrogenation. And maybe you've seen this term, partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. That is vegetable oil with unsaturated fats that has been hydrogenated. It's where we've added hydrogens. So hydrogenation not only adds hydrogens, it also changes all of these kinked carbon-carbon bonds into more straight ones. So these kinked ones, we call them cis double bonds. become straighter. We call them trans double bonds. It refers to where the hydrogens are on either side, whether they're across from each other, or whether the hydrogens are on their same side, if you're curious. So trans fats, they look and they act a lot more similar to saturated fats than unsaturated fats. Technically, trans fats are unsaturated, but our cells treat them like saturated fats. So they do the same thing as saturated fats, which is up your cholesterol, clog your arteries, right? Trans fats are nasty. Now, why do we use them then? Well, trans fats, again, act like saturated fats. Saturated fats have a much longer shelf life, right? They last much longer. So trans fats not only increase the shelf life of things, they also have a better mouthfeel. So if you want a kind of an interesting experiment, go make like a batch of brownies or something like that. You know those brownies out of the box, and they always tell you, use vegetable oil, and you're like, why do you use vegetable oil? Screw that vegetable oil. Use butter, man. Actually, let's be scientific about this. Make 2 versions, one with vegetable oil, one with melted butter. You come back, you tell me which one is better. Okay? The one with the butter, I can guarantee is going to be better, because saturated fats, they just feel better in our mouths. They have what's called a better mouthfeel. So manufacturers have used trans fats in order to mimic that saturated fat mouthfeel. Also kind of interesting, this is part of the reason why beef lasts longer in the fridge than fish and chicken. Fish and chicken has more unsaturated fats, so those degrade faster. Beef, more saturated, longer shelf life. Anyways, on to our next type of lipid. So we looked at fats, now we are looking at steroids. And here we're going to totally upend probably our normal notion of steroids. We've learned of steroids as like what bodybuilders use and stuff like that, and that is true, but there's legitimate uses for them in our cells. So when we look at a steroid and the structure of a steroid, this is actually a pretty stereotypical steroid. There's a pun in there somewhere, I just can't figure out what it is. This is a pretty stereotypical steroid right here. This is actually cholesterol. Cholesterol is a steroid. It's a really common steroid. And you can see there's mostly just carbon and hydrogen. Right here at this apex, carbon, 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 right? That makes this entire molecule really, really hydrophobic. Really hydrophobic. Remember, it's a lipid, therefore hydrophobic. And steroids are made in really complicated routes, not through that simple dehydration, condensation, hydrolysis, whatever. These take time and energy to make. When we look at a steroid, almost all of them will have these 4 hydrocarbon, made of carbon and hydrogen rings. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and they'll share sides. We say they're fused together. This part over here up top, where we have this long tail, this hydroxyl group down over here, this methyl group, that can vary from steroid to steroid. Alright, so what's attached to the rings can vary, but the rings themselves almost never will. Now what steroids do is they're used as communication molecules between cells. We said previously that estrogen and testosterone were actually steroid hormones, right? They tell our cells to behave in different ways. We'll see more examples of these. We also use them to stiffen our cell membranes. And it's really only animal cells that need steroids in order to stiffen our cell membranes. If we recall, plants have that nice thick cell wall made of cellulose. So plants don't really need stiffening, but we do. So these steroids actually help to keep us kind of upright and together. More on that later. Okay. One of the most important types of steroids are a particular class of steroids called steroid hormones. These are used as cell communication molecules. I think I'm right here in saying this. I think all of these are actually synthesized from cholesterol. So they're all made from cholesterol. You need cholesterol as your starting point. There are 2 classes of steroid hormones. Actually, there's more than two, but two for our purposes. These two classes include what are called corticosteroids and sex steroids. Corticosteroids are made by the adrenal gland. Your adrenal gland is right on top of your kidney. If you kind of feel your lower back, kind of on the side a little bit, those where your kidneys are. Kidneys are about the size of your fist. Your adrenal gland is the size of a couple fingers. Corticosteroids made by the adrenal gland include things like cortisol. Maybe you've heard of cortisol. Aldosterone. Cortisol is the stress hormone. And it tells cells to wake up, to activate. It helps to trigger inflammation, to activate our immune system. So one of the things that corticosteroids do is they actually activate our immune system. They can, kind of weirdly, they can do a little bit of both stimulation and inhibition of inflammation. Inflammation is redness and swelling. They can also regulate the rate of buildup or breakdown of certain molecules. And guess what? We know two reactions that build up and break down molecules, dehydration and hydrolysis, right? So corticosteroids can actually regulate how fast our cells do dehydration and hydrolysis reactions. Sex steroids are made by the testes and ovaries in humans, or the flower and the, I'm going to get this wrong, the anther, I think, in plants. Anyway, these sex steroids include things like estrogen and testosterone. These also regulate the buildup and breakdown of molecules and growth of certain cell types. So here's a really interesting example. If you have a large amount of estrogen in your system, estrogen will tell certain cells to grow and to get bigger and to actually convert into fat cells. And those cells are the mammary cells. So if you have excess estrogen, which most women do, right? Guess what? Your mammary cells grow. Your boobs grow. And some men actually do have excess estrogen, and that results in a condition called gynecomastia, or man boobs. Anyways, I just wanted to say man boobs. Sorry, just slammed something down there. A third class of steroids includes synthetic steroids. These are not technically a class, which is why they're in parentheses. These have to be injected or eaten. These include things like hydrocortisone, prednisone, or synthetic testosterone. I'll give you a couple examples of what these do in the next couple slides. Alright, so here's our steroid hormones. They are all derived from cholesterol. So cholesterol can be converted into our two classes of steroid hormones, sex hormones and corticosteroids. And here's estradiol, it's a form of estrogen. Here's testosterone. Look, they have those four fused rings. They look really similar to cholesterol. Here's cortisone, aka cortisol. Here's prednisone. And there's a lot more besides these, but they all share lots and lots of carbon and hydrogen and those four fused hydrocarbon rings. Okay, so I know you're wondering about this. Here we go. You don't need to know this. It's just cool. You've heard probably about steroid use in sports, right? But a lot of the illicit steroid use comes in the use of synthetic testosterone. So synthetic testosterone mimics natural testosterone, and what testosterone does is it triggers muscle cells to build more protein. And it actually does this by tricking those cells into doing more gene expression. Remember, gene expression was DNA to RNA to protein, right? We build protein. So testosterone actually tells cells to do more gene expression. And your muscle cells, when they have more protein, they have more strength. So when you inject synthetic testosterone, it just tricks cells into thinking they're getting more testosterone. And so they build more protein. Now, steroids do have a medical use, a legitimate medical use, I should say. Prednisone and hydrocortisone in particular, maybe you've heard of them. Hydrocortisone is found in right here, right? These actually tell cells of our immune system to deactivate, to shut down. And because they tell our immune system to shut down, these act as anti-inflammatories. So we use cortisone cream to treat, dry, itchy skin, bug bites, rashes, all of these are caused by an overactive immune system. Now, these are also used to treat diseases caused by an overactive immune system, like certain forms of arthritis, shingles, right? Severe allergies, itch, autoimmune diseases, etc. But these medical steroids can have some horrible side effects, so it's not recommended that you use them long term. Alright, so we looked at fats, we looked at steroids, now we're looking at phospholipids. This is the easiest one, I think. You're almost there. You're almost there. You've made it through. So again, looking at the characteristics of phospholipids. Phospholipids are kind of weird. They exist in this weird nether world of being part hydrophobic, part hydrophilic. What? What's going on with this guy? Let's take a look at him, okay? Come back to the previous slide in just a moment. Here's a phospholipid. And right off the bat, you should see this and you should go, ah, fatty acid tail. Or maybe you didn't, but hopefully next time you will, right? This is a saturated fatty acid tail. This one right here is an unsaturated fatty acid tail. Here's our 3-carbon glycerol head right there. And normally, there should be a third fatty acid tail, right? Well, here's the thing about phospholipids. They look a lot like fats, but there's one major difference. On that third carbon, instead of having a third fatty acid tail, we instead have a phosphate group. Phosphate, remember, was one of our functional groups. Remember we said you have to recognize them? Well, here we are. Have to recognize them. Okay. So that phosphate group, looking at them, lots of oxygen. Holy cow. Hydrophilic like crazy. So this molecule has a large area of hydrophobicity and a pretty powerful area of hydrophilicity too. In fact, we even use cartoons to draw them. The hydrophilic head is that glycerol head in the phosphate group, and the hydrophobic tails are these two little kinked tails. So a phospholipid kind of lives in both worlds. Now how they're manufactured is through condensation reactions. It's actually almost the exact same way that we make fats. And the only difference between fats and phospholipids is, again, just 2 fatty acid tails instead of 3. And we have a phosphate group on that third carbon. Alright. And here's the single most important thing about phospholipids. They form the cell membrane in every living thing. No exceptions. They form our cell membranes. So we are made of about 10 trillion cells. Guess what? Every single one of those cells has a cell membrane made of phospholipids. So we often like to just use the cartoon version because it's easier on the eyes, right? And here we see what happens, the cartoon version of what happens when we put phospholipids in water. So keep in mind, most of our body is water, right? 70% water. And our phospholipids kind of have to coexist uneasily with this water. What they do is something kind of cool. They'll line up in this double layer. We call this double layer a bilayer. Bilayer means, bi means 2, right? Their tails, which are hydrophobic, those fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, are trying to get away from the water. They'll point inwards along this bilayer. The heads are hydrophilic. Remember, that's the phosphate group. Very, very, very polar. Hydrophilic. The heads are okay with water. They'll point outwards. So these little phospholipids will self-assemble. They'll actually just do this all by themselves in water. They'll form this bilayer with the heads pointing outwards and the tails pointing inwards. So what this means is these phospholipids can actually form these little circles, these little spheres with water on the inside and water on the outside. And it's really hard to get across that bilayer of phospholipids. So whatever's on the inside is protected from the outside. This is a very basic cell right here. You have all of your good stuff on the inside, your nucleus, your DNA, your RNA, your proteins are all on the inside. All the horrible stuff is on the outside. Well, I mean, it's not horrible, but you get the idea. So each one of your cells is actually a tiny little bag of phospholipids. So the joke I like to make is we are all bags of fat. That is not quite accurate because phospholipids are not the same thing as fat. But it's a good joke. Okay? Leave me alone. I love this. By the way, this is a carbohydrate right here, and this is a fatty acid right there. Get it? I love this comic. Alright guys, thanks for sticking with me as always. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed, and I shall see you guys later.